So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. So I have a treat for you. So especially for our long-time listeners. So a while back on the podcast, we had Darren Woods, who is CFO at Freedom Fibre, a fast-growing enterprise. And we had a brilliant conversation all about developing teams and mentoring and supporting and growing that capability within finance. So I had loads of great feedback. So I've actually asked him to come back onto the show. And today we're going to talk about, for those, particularly those new into role, what are some of the big levers that we have the opportunity to pull as we come into a new role, and talking about not just the perceptions of finance, but also how do you start thinking about that transformation journey, especially early on in your new role as CFO. So welcome, Darren. Lovely to have you back on the show.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be asked back, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and obviously for those that perhaps haven't heard your previous episode, can you give us a little bit of a background about yourself and maybe a quick overview of Freedom Fibre as well?
Absolutely. Always conscious not to bore people with my background, but just for the benefit of the listeners. I started my career a long time ago in a manufacturing business called Sanitec. I spent 20 years in manufacturing and moved through the ranks. So I started as a factory accountant and then moved all the way through from financial controller, financial planning analysis manager, and then eventually became a CFO of Sanitec. Now, Sanitec was quite a large business, over $1 billion turnover, and a pan-European organisation with about 9,000 employees. That was private equity backed. So my first exposure to private equity, and worked with them at a CFO level for just over 3 years in my 20-year stint there. But I did spend 7 years in the kind of pan-European executive team before making CFO. After that, I moved on to Hugh & Stewart, again, a private equity-backed business, and spent best part of 5 years there, just over 5 years, I think, in a much broader role, actually, CFO and kind of chief operating officer, really. So covered all of the head office functions, HR, IT, those kind of things as well. And then after that, I moved to a small consultancy business and was a director in that business for 3 or so years to help them transition, and effectively they got sold to a larger business successfully. And then for the last 4 years, I've been within telecoms, and I started off within Fibre Nation, which was a business backed by TalkTalk. And then more latterly, in the last couple of years, we started ourselves a new business called Freedom Fibre. I'm one of the founding directors of that business, and we are scaling rapidly. It's been a remarkable journey. And I think I said last time, it's something I've never experienced in my career before and probably never will again. So for the listeners' benefit, we started the business we founded the business at the end of 2020. We raised 5 million of seed capital to allow us to start trading in March 21. And from that point, we've added some more seed capital. And then May last year, we secured 100 million capital investment from an infrastructure investor, Equitix, and also some debt from Santander. So we're now motoring, growing very fast. Our employee base in March 21 was 6 of us. By December 21, it was 70. And currently we're at 210. So we're growing quite quickly. And we're now into, bizarrely, the second round of capital raise as well. So looking for kind of circa another 100 million or so to develop the business in the next few years.
Wow, and that's a rocket ship to be riding. In a very short space of time, you guys have obviously grown hugely. So, as you came into that role, I guess with your CFO hat on, if we talk about, what you wanted for finance, what was your ambition for finance as you came in?
I think it's a really good question. What's my ambition for finance? When I was making some notes for this session, I reflected back on my journey from my first CFO position. So when I moved into Sanitec, Hannah, I came internally within the business. And when you come from the business internally, you have a particular perspective on the business because you know the understanding of the business, you know what the business does. And really what you're doing is gravitating into a much bigger and broader responsibility. when I came into Freedom Fibre, it's a relatively new business, I don't know the business from the grassroots up, as it were. So you're coming in with a different perspective. So I think, to answer your question, and I'm not dodging your question, but I'm just framing it really, that I think depending on whether you come as a CFO into a business externally or internally, I think your expectations of what finance needs to deliver and what's expected are different. And I think when I joined and we started to create Freedom Fibre, a lot of my expectations were based on the last 15 or 20 years of working as a CFO in many different sectors and seeing what I liked and what I didn't like, and the pitfalls that I've gone through that have caused me pain, and the things that I never want to repeat again, but the things I do want to repeat again. Now, to answer your question, in a business of startup, the most important thing, not surprisingly, is cash. So the one thing that you can't do is run out of money. And even though we've secured 100 million of capital, for quite a long period of our journey in the first 12 months, we had no certainty of capital at all. So every single decision you make in order to spend or invest money is a really big decision. And at the minute, it's easy to talk about large numbers. We have 111 million of capital, and we're looking to raise, as I said, another 100 million. So they're kind of monopoly numbers. In reality, when you start a business like this, you're looking after every £100 and £1,000 to make sure that you're not wasting money, so that you get to the position where you can actually successfully raise that large capital round.
And that's an interesting piece. So obviously you're further down your journey now. Have your ambitions for finance changed, or are they still cash flow is king? Or are there other priorities that are starting to creep up into your view as CFO?
Well, when I did my degree in finance, it had many different elements to it. One of them was the behavioural science, and probably everybody anyway, will have been taught about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's the classic triangle, and at the bottom you've got the basics that are human needs, which is food, shelter, warmth. And as you move through that, you move through the levels of development and well-being. But at its truest sense, you have to start at the bottom. So you have to feel as though you've got food and warmth and shelter. And I think the same applies in a business. So cash is, in my hierarchy of needs, is the first step. There's absolutely no point in being a CFO if you focus all your energy on some of the extra levels above that if you run out of cash, because the reality is you're not going to go anywhere with this business. So I think it's really good as a new CFO coming in to be able to understand what is it the type of business you're joining needs from you. What are the hierarchy of needs for that business? Now, if you're starting in I've been very, very fortunate in my career, Hannah. I've worked in, and again, it's funny when you note these things down. The first business I was involved in was a 100-year-old plus business. So it was very stable. It had a very good understanding of where the value's created. It had a longevity and a stability. The next business I worked in was a 50-year-old business and had a different dynamic to it. And then the next business was a 30-year-old business. And now we're at a kind of like brand new startup business. And each of those has a different requirement from you as a CFO. Now, my objective against all of those roles was similar in some respects. You want to have a high functioning and high performing finance team. You want to feel as though you're a trusted partner across the business. You want to feel as though you're at the leading edge of strategy and strategic decisions. You want to feel as though you're creating value for shareholders, for employees, for customers and suppliers. So I'd be amazed if there's many CFOs that don't have those ambitions. I think the challenge really is understanding what are the hierarchy of needs that you need to address as well. If you're not careful, I think too many people, when they move into their first position, feel as though they've got to immediately move into strategic direction. And while strategic direction is important, you can't lose sight of the fact that it's the small things that make the difference. And I think for me, it depends on where the business is at. So when I created Freedom Fibre, for the first time in 20 years, I was doing some bank reconciliations because we didn't have a finance team. So it would be pointless of me in those early days spending all of my time on strategy when the bank hasn't been reconciled. And as we've grown and developed the team, we've been able to start to say, well, how do we now allocate responsibilities across the team that frees me up and other members of the team to think about where do we take the business next? There's a great piece of work that back in my career, Deloitte used to do, I think they still do it, a kind of CFO program. And the CFO program, I put a number of members of my team on that in the past, and they have a kind of matrix that talks about the CFO balancing their time between strategist, catalyst, operator, and steward. And you can broadly break those down into the strategies and catalyst are kind of externally looking, and the operator and steward are internally looking. And I think there's a danger when you become a CFO for the first time that you think that most of your time has to be on strategy and catalyst. And whilst you do have to allocate some time to that, it's in reality making sure you get the balance so that you don't trip up over the steward and the operator problems because you've invested all your time in the strategy and the catalyst stuff. I mean, to put that in perspective, probably in my early days at Freedom Fibre, I would say probably 5% of my time was in strategy and 95% was in operator and steward. The 5% of my time in strategy was about picking the tools that we needed to embed now that would start to give us benefit in the next 12 or 18 months when we secure more capital. But once that decision was taken, a lot of my time was making sure that the cash didn't run out and making sure that we were still here in 12 months to make sure we could do the next thing. So I think it depends on the situation you're in and being realistic enough to understand the challenges that are in front of you and the business so that you put your time in the right place at the right time.
And if we think about that, because I really like that concept of almost like finance hierarchy of needs, right? We might have to call it the Woods hierarchy of needs. But if we think about the layers within that, because you said it's different, but is it that each organization has weaknesses at different levels of the hierarchy, or that the actual fundamental hierarchy is different? Because I feel like from what you're saying, and certainly my experience, is that absolutely cash flow sits at the bottom, right? You've got nothing without that business. You've then got your core accounting function, haven't you? So, can we pay bills? Can we pay payroll? Can we, does our bank match those, do we fundamentally have the accounts or principles? How would you see that hierarchy going up once you've got those two sort of core pillars? And is there anything I'm missing at the bottom?
Well, it's a really good question. I think at the bottom of your hierarchy that we just talked about is probably correct. So I think it's really one of the things that allows, comparing it to Maslow's hierarchy, it's the things that make sure the business doesn't die, basically. And I think cash and the core accounting principles are the foundations of that particular hierarchy. I wouldn't disagree with you. I think it's interesting, just to go off at a tangent for a second, that there's a couple of pieces of data in the marketplace at the minute, which I don't think have changed that much in the last 2 years. One is that the average kind of career life expectancy of a private equity CFO is about 18 months. And that hasn't changed much actually in the last few years. So it's not unusual when you become a CFO in a PE business that the clock is already ticking whether you're going to last out 2 years or not. And the other is that Heidrick Struggles did some work last August looking at the changing demands of CFOs. And interestingly, only the percentage of CFOs that had 15 plus years experience operating as a CFO in private equity businesses a drop from 34% to 30% in their survey. And they'd surveyed, I think it was around about 5,000 plus CFOs. So the demands on CFOs to do more than the basics, more than just cash and more than just getting the accounts right, are tremendously high. And the next levels up in your hierarchy would be creating value, shareholder value, and the catalyst for getting the best returns on capital employed, as well as a high-functioning finance team that empowers and allows the CFO to step out of some of the detail. The real problem comes that in amongst all of that is an intangible, which is basically called chemistry. And as you get to the top of the CFO organization, you need to make sure you've got the right chemistry with the shareholders and the stakeholders you're working with. It's not unusual for a private equity business just not to like the way you work. And it's a difficult thing to swallow if you're a very capable accountant or a very capable finance director, that you think, well, I'm doing all the right things here. My books add up. My cash flow is strong. But somehow I don't seem to be the right person for this business. And the reality is that we all talk about the most important asset in any business is its people. And part of that asset is making sure that they're people who share a common goal and a common purpose. And that could be strategic direction, it could be mission, it could be cultural values, it could be any of those. And quite often, as you get to the top of your career, you need to make sure that that relationship and that alignment is very strong. And that's why quite often the relationship between CEO and CFO is one of the strongest that you have in any business. And I think, so in that hierarchy and that kind of needs, right at the top would be that kind of making sure you've got alignment in vision, strategy, mission, purpose. And that can be very, very different per business and per ownership.
So there's lots of things I want to pull out of what you just said there, Darren. So I'm going to start at the beginning. Now, you stated and talked about the average time as a PE CFO, and that 18 months seems incredibly short for what is seen as a long-term strategic role. So what's your view on why it's that short? Is it that people come in for a purpose and it's like a CFO for all seasons? They come in with a purpose, they deliver it, they move on. Do you think it's that that's more about them being pushed into different roles? What's your opinion on that stat that you shared?
I mean, if you Google that stat, it's pretty well digested across the internet. I remember when I first became a CFO at Sanitec in 2007, the bank we were working with turned around to me and said exactly that stat, that the average life will be 18 months. So if you last more than 18 months, you'll have done well. And I remember feeling remarkably shocked at that point. So I don't think it's changed much in almost 20 years or 15 years anyway. The reason I think is that the other piece of information I'll add into the mix is that I've worked with about 4 or 5 private equity owners now. One thing is consistent, is that there is a pace in private equity that maybe doesn't exist in other businesses. And somebody once said to me that working in private equity for 12 months is like working in other businesses for 4 years. Or to put it another way, every 3 months in a PE-backed business is like 1 year in other businesses. And I think that's quite true. And I think it's true because the demand for returns and the demand to improve the business is so high within private equity that there is no room for complacency, no room at all. And I'll share with you another story, which just makes me laugh, and I'll share it with you anyway. But earlier in my career, I was in a board meeting, and the chief operating officer presented to invest in a strategic purchasing team to the private equity board and the board which I was part of. And he was asking for 10 strategic buyers across this large business in order to deliver 20 million of savings. And everybody nodded and said it's a very good plan. And the PE partner turned around and said, so 10 strategic buyers gets me 20 million, then you can have 20 and I'll have my 40 million. Thank you very much. And the chief operating officer kind of looked and said, it doesn't work like that. And the private equity guy said, well, you need to make it work like that because that's what we need. And it's that kind of laser focus on value, which I think is very much defines private equity. And I guess the other point I'd say, Hannah, is it's a little bit like Premiership football clubs changing football managers. The demands are very high. So you're constantly looking for the win and the next level of improvement. And if that isn't arriving, then quite often a private equity business will see the CFO and the CEO as being the people that need to be exchanged. The final point I'll make is that you tend to find a private equity business will change a CFO when they make an acquisition. So if there's a change of ownership, then it's not unusual that the private equity owner wants to put their own team in. And PE businesses, the usual term of a PE business is 3 to 5 years. It does vary significantly, but that's the average. So not surprisingly, that prompts a change of senior team as well. But it's a tough environment.
And I guess that's something to consider as you're coming into a new role, is the environment, like you say, that you're coming into. We talk about, taking the time to get the basics right, but you've also got to get the basics right and deliver value within a very short space of time if you want to be still in your role. Probably we're saying 18 months, but by sounds of it, the cards are already set well before then. So, and I think that's but that puts a huge amount of pressure on both the CFO and finance team. But it's also a really good way to look at it, isn't it? How do you speed up your time to value as a CFO? How do you drive more impact? And, balancing and juggling plates, because that's what it becomes about. You need to get that cash flow under control, the accounting working, but you fundamentally need to start driving improvements in the business and supporting the CEO to do that within an incredibly short space of time. So, I know we're talking very much about PE backed, but I don't see why that shouldn't apply across the wider board. And maybe the PE guys just have a bit more laser focus on delivering that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think for new CFOs coming into post, there's a couple of things worth to think about. I think, first of all, I think the ownership structure is an important part of what the business needs from a CFO. So we've talked about private equity. There are other ownership structures, obviously, whether your company's listed, whether it's large or small, mid-size, whether it's a startup, whether it's got private investment, which is not the typical private equity. All of those give you a different perspective on what shareholders and stakeholders are looking for from a CFO. I think then you've got, where it is on its journey of growth. So is it in startup mode? Is it growing? Is it stable? Is the market you're involved in a growth market or a restructuring market? So you've got that to overlay as well. And then I think you've always got, my advice to any new CFO is to sit down with the CEO at some point and say, what's the 3 things that keep you awake at night? Because I think as a CFO, you need to be aligned on addressing those 3 things. And usually that will give you a pretty good indicator of where some of your time needs to be spent. The old adage works, make your boss look good. And I know, people forget that. But if you sit down and work very hard to try and make sure that you're aligned with what's troubling your boss, and you can get alignment on that, then generally you get a win-win out of these things. And typically the CEO will be losing sleepless nights over things that you can help them with.
That's a really good question to ask. And I don't think I've heard anyone phrase it in that way. But and we talk about that bond with that CEO being incredibly important as when you come into a new CFO role. But, it's not just, like you say, about, having that relationship. It's about, delivering on what it is that they need to be able to step away. Yeah. So we've talked about, obviously the coming into the role and how the expectations might differ from depending on the ownership structure. But one of the things I want to get into is almost, from a PE perspective, what is the PE perspective of what finance should be?
Well, again, there isn't a simple answer here. And I in my career, I've been described as Marmite, really. So I think some private equity businesses are like a CFO, which is a pure numbers person. And they're more akin to a finance director rather than a CFO. And then other private equity owners, like a CFO to be more of a business leader and help to drive value through the business. And just depends on the type of PE house you're working with, really. My preference is to be the latter. So I like to be involved in driving business value. I like to be part of the leadership team that's driving change. And a number of my roles have been in a kind of deputy CEO role. And for me, I'm a huge advocate of the fact that when you walk into the boardroom or the executive suite, you shouldn't really be able to know the roles that people do. I think everybody at the table there should be a business leader. So the days of saying, well, that's the finance guy and that's the ops guy and that's the commercial guy, I think those days should be gone, because I think you need a diverse leadership team, gender as well as experience. And I think it's important that anybody around the senior table has the ability to lead an organization, because I think that's what we need in these ever-changing times, lots of leadership. Whereas there are some private equity businesses that really want the lead finance person to be just focused on the bottom two layers of that hierarchy we talked about. Make sure the cash is okay, make sure the numbers add up, make sure there's no problems in the accounts. So I think it just depends on which organization you're working with, really.
And that sounds like that comes down from, before you even step into that role, is actually understanding the purpose that you've been brought on for, I guess.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
And how much, you've worked in a couple of different roles, how did you approach actually getting hold of that? Because I guess what the PE backers versus the CEO want might almost be slightly different. So how do you approach getting hold of what not just what is needed, but what the different stakeholders want within the organisation?
Well, I turn that around, first of all, Hannah. I think in business generally, in your career generally, I'm going to go off at a tangent for a second, but I'm helping a graduate at the minute with some interview practice. It's just a friend of the family, and I'm kind of spending a little bit of time just talking them through how to approach an interview and how to prepare themselves. Because sadly, for most graduates, they don't really get any preparation for how to approach an interview, and the kind of questions they'll get asked, and they're not difficult. Why do you want to do this job? What attracts you to this business? What do you bring? And all that kind of stuff. And they're questions which really, on the face of it, seem very easy to answer, but unless you've prepared an answer to them, then the danger is that you'll think of an answer on the spot. And at that point, then you're already on a downward spiral, to be fair. Now, in amongst all of the advice, part of it comes around what jobs should I be applying for? Because as a graduate, you want to try and get into any job that's going. And my advice is, certainly to this individual, is don't just apply for any job because it's a job, because the danger is that you might end up in a role that you really don't like, and within a few weeks or within a month or so, you realize you've made a horrible mistake. So I think you've got to be clear to start with on who you are and what you bring to the party. I know that the kind of finance lead I am is somebody that likes to be involved in the business. I like to be part of the leadership team and be part of change. I'm not somebody who wants to spend all of their day focusing on the numbers. Now, if you are that kind of person, and there are many private equity business and other businesses that want that kind of finance lead, then you very quickly understand from the job description and the first interview whether this is the right place for you or not. If it isn't, and it doesn't fit with the kind of person you are and the role you want to do, then you've got to be able to step away from that role. Because otherwise you're in danger of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And I've never seen that work. So there's a saying the first finance director I worked for said, you've got to be comfortable in your own skin. And I do believe that. I think you've got to have a self-confidence of what you're good at and promote that. I think you've got to have an awareness of the areas where you've got gaps, and you either plug those by recruiting into your finance team or work very hard to develop them, depending on what those gaps are. But don't try to be something you're not, because I've never seen that work.
That's a really good piece. I think actually what we're saying there is that the success that you see in the first, to be successful in the first 18 months as a CFO is that you, especially in your first role, it needs to be a role that plays to your strengths. So actually, the one thing anybody that's listening to the podcast is that wanting to step up into that CFO role, I guess the first massive piece of advice is find the right role to step into. One where and that's I think why a lot of people step up into roles within an organization they're already in, because they have that knowledge of the organization they're working, which gives them an advantage. And why it's harder to make, I think, transitions across different industries or different organizations and get into a new CFO role there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I don't know the stats on this, Hannah, but I would guess that the vast majority of first-time CFOs are promoted internally, and which makes perfect sense because the business knows you, they know how you operate, you know the business. It's relatively low risk for the business involved. I think that does bring in itself a challenge. So if you take the two examples of you're moving into a business as a CFO, then you've got two things to think about. One is you've got to learn the business. And secondly, you've got to learn the structure, the shareholding, the politics, as well as you've got to bring an idea of what you stand for. If you're promoted internally, you know the shareholding, you know the structure, you know the business. So those things you've already covered, but you've got a much more difficult challenge on defining what you stand for because you've come from within the business itself. And I think that's where you've got to sit down and think very carefully about which elements that you inherited are you going to retain and which elements are you going to change. And the reasons why you're going to do that. Changing everything because you've just been promoted into the top job has an element of radicalism that you might live to regret. And Liz Truss kind of fell foul of that last year. Changing the key things that really underlines what you stand for, and they could be small things, can have a really massive impact on your new role as a CFO or the lead finance in this business. But choosing what to change and what to keep where you're promoted internally is actually a really big challenge and something that warrants some real attention because that's what you'll be defined for. Everybody knows who you are. Everybody's seen you operate. More often than not, they'll not be surprised you've been promoted into the top job. So don't lose sight of the things. A bit back to my point on be comfortable in your own skin. Yeah, build on the things that you're good at and people know you're good at. Yeah, plug your gaps, whether it's through development or, whether it's through changing your team. But then, probably sit down with the CEO and form a new relationship saying, what are the three things that keep you awake at night? And maybe use that as your platform for change, because then you've got a mandate. So rather than you dreaming up, I feel as though we need to reorganize the structure of the teams, or I feel as though we need to go in this direction. If you've got a clear direction from the CEO, it gives you some purpose then to build on. And then the organization will probably respect you for that because you're trying to solve the CEO's problems.
Yeah, and I love that summary, Darren. And it reminds me of an email I've recently had from a new head of transformation. So she will know who she is when she listens to this podcast. But she emailed me saying, "Do you have any advice?" Right, and I think it's very aligned with what you're saying, Darren. I think and I think the same is true for a new CFO: is understand the problem that you are solving before you start trying to go about and solve it.
Yep.
So be really clear on what is the problem, and not just the surface level problem, the symptom that you're seeing, but understanding the underlying problem that's driving, the pain. And secondly, don't try and change too much too fast. I think there is always that danger that, as you go into a new role, you're incredibly excited about that new role, the impact you're going to have. But there is a point, isn't there, about bringing the team along, especially when you're coming from within an organization, taking that team on that journey with you, and not creating barriers by moving too fast.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I think you have time on your side. I know we talked about the 18 months and that kind of lifespan, but if you put that to one side, you've got certainly the first classic 100 days to form your thinking. And if you understand, typically shareholders and a board, have put you into the position because you know the business and they're looking for you really to create value in that business. Typically, if you're promoted internally, unless there's been a major problem with governance, typically they're looking for you to build on the stability that's within the business and use your knowledge of the business to create value. Usually that's what they're looking for. There are exceptions where they're looking for, things to change in a restructuring, but you'll get that mandate. You'll be given that clear, we need to shake things up here. Are you the person for this, even though you're coming internally? But if that's not been said, then I think you have time on your side. So use the time wisely, because you can achieve a lot over 3 or 6 months by doing small steps at a time rather than open heart surgery and big boom. And I think that's, it's important to digest the new role, get your feet under the table and have clarity on what's coming. And the other thing, which is obvious, is that the world around you keeps changing anyway. So as soon as you start to get your feet under the table, there'll be new challenges come, and it'll allow you time, without moving too many other variables, to deal with those. What you don't want to do is start to open up battles on too many fronts. You've got to be able to embrace the challenges coming at the business, as well as restructure, change, and create value at the same time. And I'm a huge advocate of paired comparisons. So my team get kind of bored of this, but we've all got about 50 or 60 things on our to-do list. If you don't, then you're probably not fully engaged in the role you're in. But most of us have 50 or 60 things they'd like to do. You've got to be able to do a paired comparisons and say, if I take 2 of them together, which is the most important? And force yourself into really which is the one that I need to solve and address today. And if you do that on a regular basis, and I would say I do that 2 or 3 times a week. Yeah. So I look at my diary for tomorrow and do paired comparisons, because my diary is blocked out pretty much every day, back-to-back meetings. And I've now, moved to a point of putting break points in my diary to make sure they don't get blocked out, because Outlook is fantastic at allowing other people access to your diary and booking meetings. But it means that you've got no space in your life to do things. So I think, I constantly look at the paired comparisons of, do I need to be in that meeting? Do I not need to be in that meeting? Yeah. Do I need to do this week? Do I need to do that this week? Because I only have so many hours in the week. And I think the paired comparisons is a tremendously important rigor almost every day of spending your time in the right places.
So some great tips there, and I think if I recap what I've heard so far. So the first thing is make sure you're in the right role for the right reasons, and make sure it's a role that plays to your strength. We're going to use the phrase, don't do a Liz Truss, don't change too much too fast, and move at the pace of the business, not at the pace that you necessarily want to go. Love the feedback on that. The ultimate question is to your CEO, what are the three things that keep you up at night? And, like you say, Darren, prioritization, what are the priorities? Because there is so much that you could be doing. The question is, what do you have to do to make an impact at that point? So what have I missed? We've covered so much ground. I think everyone has probably been listening to the podcast, frantically scrabbling notes. We might have to send a summary out afterwards. But if you had to summarize, what are the key things going into a new role? What would it be that you would say to a new starter or mentee that you're working with?
Well, I think the first thing would be, all of us in our studies will look at the kind of SWOT analysis. I do a proper SWOT analysis on your business. Yeah, what is the kind of business you're moving into, whether it's internally or externally, so you understand where the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are of that business. So, and do it objectively. Don't do it with all of the emotion that comes with either the new appointment or the kind of things you've been told. Do it as if you were doing it for your MBA or something like that. And that will help you to have a clarity on what this business needs from you as a CFO. Because ultimately, the shareholders and the board are entrusting you to do the right thing for this business. Now, as part of that SWOT, you'll understand whether it's a startup, whether it's in growth, whether it's in restructuring, where it is in its journey. But do that objectively to start with, because you should never lose sight of where this business is at and what it needs from you. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is, ask your CEO those 3 questions, because you should really get some alignment with those 3 questions of what keeps me awake with your SWOT analysis. And then the third thing is, be very clear that you're comfortable in your own skin. doing the things that you know you're good at. And there is an element of have confidence in your own ability, but also recognize where you have gaps and either plug them through your team by recruiting into your team. And me, and I've said this in the past, my tax is not an area that I would say is my strength. So I always try to recruit a good tax manager, or at least have a good relationship there, so that we make sure that we don't trip over everything. But there are other areas that I feel very strong at, and they would be kind of lower down my priority list. So I think they're the key three things really that you need to bear in mind. And as you said, I guess wrapped around that is don't do a Liz Truss really. Don't try and change everything at once. I have spoken to many FDs and CFOs in my time, and there are some before they get to that level that seem almost driven by the job title in its own right, as in my career ambition is to get the title FD or CFO. And I'd always be very guarded against that, because I think the ambition should be want to be lead a business through the finance function, or create shareholder value by effectively being that person that drives value in the business. The job title, if I'm honest with you, doesn't bring anything with it. Yeah. And I think there's a danger by thinking that somehow achieving the job title somehow changes everything, and it doesn't. If you've been promoted internally, the job title itself won't change anything. Unless you change the way you operate and think, it won't change anything. And then 3 or 4 months after you've joined and changed the job title, you'll start to wonder why things aren't going exactly as you thought they would do. I think you've got to start off with the right mentality of the job title is secondary. Yeah, don't worry about the job title. Don't worry about that status. Think about those 3 points, yeah? And if you do that, I think you'll be halfway there.
Amazing. Well, as on our previous episode, Darren, it's been an absolute pleasure and so much insight shared. I'm not even sure we covered everything that we were talking about in terms of this agenda, but what we have covered, I think, has been incredibly useful, potentially even more useful for a new CFO coming into either a new role or starting their first CFO role. So thank you again, Darren. It's been wonderful to have you back on the show, and hopefully we'll be able to grab you back on to talk about everything else that we didn't quite get around to today.
It'd been my pleasure to talk to you again, Hannah. So thank you very much for having me back.
No, brilliant. And for all of our listeners, perhaps you were listening to this and there was a question I should have asked, or an area that we should have delved into. So please do feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Tell me what questions I missed. Tell me what I should ask Darren next time, because he absolutely has so much knowledge and experience to share. So thank you again, Darren. Hopefully we'll see you back on the podcast soon. And for all of our listeners, please do, if you like this episode, please do leave us a review. Do like and share it on LinkedIn or your social network of choice. Because it all just helps us spread the word and help other CFOs in the community. So thanks, Darren. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you again soon.